A president's job is to lead the country and create policies that better the country. No matter what your political affiliation is, we can all agree that every president has created policies with the goal of bettering the country. Whether or not you actually believe that they do better the country is irrelevant. Today, we're not going to focus on the controversial. Okay, at least not the majorly controversial policies that the last 3 presidents have made in spaceflight. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to do this in one 10 to 15 minute episode, so we're going to break this down into 3 different episodes as part of a mini-series. Part 1 will focus on President Bush's Constellation program, Part 2 will look at the Obama era, and Part 3 will look at President Trump's plan and where NASA is going. But before we begin, I want to do a quick disclaimer. It won't matter much in this part, but will probably start to be a thing in the next 2 episodes. I am a Democrat. I did not vote for President Trump and do not support any, if all, of his policies. Though, I will say I do like Administrator Brian Steen. I wasn't too fond of him at first, but he's definitely grown on me. But in doing these episodes, we're going to try and be as fair and unbiased as possible. So, with that out of the way, let's talk space.
I never want to hold again.
Falcon Heavy is in startup.
Go Atlas. Go Centaur.
Status check.
Go Delta.
5, 4, 3.
So, President Bush's space policy wasn't meant to be anything major. His administration was meant to oversee the construction of the ISS and the initial research that entails. But that all changed on February 1st, 2003. The Space Shuttle Columbia was set to come home from a nearly 16-day mission in space. She never made it home. You see, during the launch, a piece of insulation from the external tank hit the leading edge of the orbiter's left wing. The hole compromised the shuttle's heat shield. And when it re-entered, The investigation into the incident determined that the space shuttle should be retired after the completion of the ISS. But this meant that President Bush needed to design an outline for NASA after the ISS was complete. This outline would come to be known as the Constellation program. The Constellation program called for NASA to return crew to the moon no later than 2020 using the Altair lander and the Orion Crew Exploration Vehicle. This program also created 2 new rockets for NASA, the Ares 1, which would put the Orion capsule into low Earth orbit, and the Ares 5, which would put all the cargo for a mission into orbit. Okay, so let's break this program down by the vehicles it proposed. The Altair lander, the Orion capsule, Ares 1, and Ares 5. Let's start with Ares 1. So, Ares 1, also referred to as the Stick, was a rocket that NASA would use to send crew to low Earth orbit and the ISS. Ares 1 used a 5-segment solid rocket booster as its first stage, and then a liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen upper stage powered by a J2X. The J2X engines come from the J2 engines that powered the Saturn V's second and third stage. These engines have never really left development and have been worked on throughout the years, and the J2X was a more powerful engine than ever before. But Ares 1 had some problems. First, during the initial ascent, the solid rocket motor first stage caused serious vibrations. These vibrations were so bad that NASA ranked them a 4 out of 5 stars on a risk scale. But this problem was also identified fairly early in Ares 1 development and would likely have been solved before crew ever flew on the vehicle. But there was also another problem. A study by the 45th Space Wing found that an abort between 30 and 60 seconds would almost definitely kill the crew. This was because Orion would be engulfed in the cloud made from the launch until it landed. Now, had Ares 1 used a liquid first stage, this wouldn't have been a problem. But because it's a solid vehicle, it's a very different plume. You see, a liquid-fueled rocket's plume is generally safe to fly through after the vehicle and the explosion has cleared by. Like, Delta IV's plume is literally water after the explosion. But a solid plume is literally burning particles. And because Orion is in the plume until it lands, the parachute would have been destroyed by the particles that reach a temperature of nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So this leaves the crew in a vehicle that would crash land if something went seriously wrong in the initial stages of flight. And if you remember, one of the main issues that led to the end of the space shuttle was the lack of abort capabilities for the shuttle. So this would have been another problem that would have needed to be solved before you fly crew on Ares 1. And these issues were fairly clear to NASA. In fact, in 2005, 2008, and 2009, NASA ran studies on crew rating one of the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicles, the EELVs. The EELV program was a program run by the Air Force to build medium to heavy lift vehicles for the Air Force's needs. The two vehicles that came out of this were Delta IV in all of its configurations and the Atlas V. And it was determined that Delta IV could do the job of Ares 1, but would have required huge upgrades. Remember how last time we said that Delta IV simplicity both helped and hurt it? Yeah, this is where it hurts. The fireball at launch and the ablatively cooled RS-68s were too unsafe for crew rating. But NASA did consider putting crew on Delta IV Heavy, with a bunch of changes. And this is probably the reason that Exploration Flight Test 1 was conducted aboard a Delta IV Heavy instead of any other vehicle. Okay, so now we're at least familiar with Ares 1. Let's talk about Ares 5. Kind of looks familiar, right? Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I don't know why, though. Wait a second. You're not Ares 5. SLS, get out of here. We've already done a video on you. Ares 5, where are you? Ah, here it is. See, completely different vehicle. So, with Constellation, NASA was looking to try something different compared to the Space Shuttle and the Apollo program, flying cargo on a separate launch than crew. So, when you fly cargo with crew, this generally leads to a vehicle that can send a lot into orbit, but usually costs a large amount of money. But if you launch crew on a smaller vehicle, you can save a bit of development cost of the heavy lift vehicle by not having to crew rate it. But your overall cost for launch will be a bit more because you have to support two vehicles. So there are ups and downs to doing this. Okay, so now that we know the rationale behind Ares 5, let's talk about the actual components of Ares 5. First, it used two 5-segment solid rocket boosters and a core stage that was developed based off of the Space Shuttle's external tank. Seriously, I don't know where I've seen this vehicle before. Hey SLS, do you know where you've seen this vehicle before? No? Okay. Now, because Ares 5 was still years away from flying, the specific details of the rocket were still being worked on. For instance, the solid rocket boosters might not have been 5 segments, but instead have been 5.5 segments. Also, they never determined which engines would be used on the upper stage. There are basically 3 options for this. It could have used either 5 or 6 RS-68Bs, which would have fixed some of the issues that Delta IV Heavy had, or it could have used 5 RS-25s. Now, the upper stage on Ares 5 was a derivative of the S-4B that was used on the Saturn V as its third stage, or the Saturn 1B as the second stage. Like Ares 1, it would have used the J2X engine, but more importantly, Ares 5 would have been able to put 188 metric tons in low Earth orbit and 71 metric tons on a translunar injection. Now, one of the things with the Ares 5 upper stage is it also would have been used to do the translunar injection for Orion. You see, they would have launched Orion into orbit and then they would have launched the cargo, or vice versa. The order was never really specific. And then the Orion would meet up with the cargo and they would use the Ares 5 upper stage to push it out to a translunar injection. But Constellation was recently in the news again because Vice President Pence made a claim a few weeks ago.
Now, some say that America doesn't need to go back to the moon, that we ought to focus on issues closer to home. That attitude was probably best described in one of my favorite movies called Interstellar. Remember that scene on the front porch? It was an incredible quote. One of the characters in the movie said, and I quote, "We used to look up at the sky and wonder at our place in the stars. Now we just look down and worry about our place in the dirt." That's not how Americans think. Truthfully, that kind of thinking led people in the past to even cancel the Constellation program. That would have put Americans back on the moon by 2020 and set the stage for exploration of Mars and beyond. That decision was a mistake.
This is completely wrong. In late 2009, and I know this is outside of the Bush administration, but stay with me for a second, we kind of need to talk about this. But in late 2009, the Augustine Commission found that due to technical and financial problems, it is unlikely that Ares 1 would have flown with crew until between 2017 and 2019, or if given Apollo blank check levels of funding 2016. Now, this seems great when compared to SLS's 2023 crewed flight, but you have to remember, SLS is taking crew to the moon. Ares 1 would have just taken crew to the ISS or low Earth orbit. And Ares 1 is the smaller of the two vehicles and would have had priority funding over Ares 5 because it would have had to end our reliance on Russia to get to the ISS. So basically, you need to have Ares 1 up and running before you can even consider having Ares 5. And the Augustine Commission also concluded that Ares 5 would not have been ready before the mid-2020s. And that was only if NASA had a $3 billion increase in funding and retired the ISS in 2015. Without these, it was unlikely that we would have seen Ares 5 fly before the late 2020s. Okay, I think we've covered the rockets enough, but there is one more rocket that was under consideration known as Ares 4, but it's also basically just a placeholder for Ares 5 developments. It would have used the Ares 5 core and boosters with the Ares 1 upper stage, so it's not really important in the grand scheme of things, so let's talk about the vehicles. Like the Apollo program, Constellation created a moon lander and a crew capsule. The crew vehicle was initially known as the Crew Exploration Vehicle. Now, initially the CEV was supposed to be a delta wing styled space plane, but NASA kind of wanted to move away from space planes given the country was still recovering from the Columbia disaster. So they decided to go with a blunt-bodied style capsule like those used in NASA's early manned spacecrafts like Apollo. This capsule became known as Orion and would carry between 2 to 6 astronauts on missions lasting up to 21 days, without any external modules, like a habitation module to give the crew a bit more living quarters. But we'll continue to talk about Orion throughout this series. It's one of the few things that actually survives through Constellation. In fact, it's kind of the only thing, because, spoilers, Constellation's canceled, guys. I know, shock. Vice President Pence kind of spoiled it a bit earlier. So let's talk about the moon lander, Altair. The Altair lander is basically a really beefed up version of the Lunar Excursion module, though it took some of the shortcomings of the LM and corrected them. For instance, the Altair lander would have used an airlock to do moon walks, unlike the LM where you had to depressurize everything to go outside. Altair also would have come in 3 different configurations. A shorty mode for short flights to the moon like those of the Apollo program, typically lasting about 7 days on the moon. An outpost mode with no airlock and would have been used for the start of a lunar base and could have stayed on the moon for up to 210 days. And an uncrewed cargo mode for sending supplies to a moon base. Also, like the LEM, the Altair lander would have used 2 stages, a descent stage and an ascent stage, to get to the surface and back up to low moon orbit. And finally, Altair would have taken all of the crew to the surface, leaving Orion uncrewed in low lunar orbit. However, it should be noted that Altair was in a conceptual design and was nowhere near being ready to fly. But I think that's going to about do it for this episode. We covered the basics of the Constellation program, and honestly, in my personal opinion, Constellation was a good program, but it bit off a bit more than it could chew. Because here's the thing, we left a lot out of this episode. Some of which we're going to talk about in the next episode, like the beginning of the COTS program and the CRS program, and the beginning of Commercial Crew. But we also left out the fact that the moon was only a stepping stone for Constellation, and that Phase 2 of Constellation would have dealt with a mission to Mars, and so much more. On top of that, the Bush administration secured funding for many important programs like New Horizons, the Curiosity rover, the Kepler Space Telescope, and so much more. Like, honestly, we could fill an entire second episode on things we left out and still have to leave things out. And on top of all of that, one of the most important accomplishments of the Bush administration was it restored America's confidence to fly again after the Columbia disaster. Like, it's kind of a miracle that the ISS was able to be complete by 2010, when you consider all that went wrong with Columbia and the years that we took to get it right and figure it out, having to restore the confidence and build a new space program, basically. So yeah, like, there's so much that the Bush administration doesn't get credit for. There's a lot that they get credit for and they deserve. Trust me. But again, when it comes to spaceflight, the Bush administration set up the beginning of NASA for the next 30 years. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We try to post space discussion videos like this every other Saturday. Doesn't always happen, but we at least try. And we also post 2 new space newscasts a week on Tuesdays and Fridays. But I'm Kyle Henry. Thank you so much for watching. My social medias are in the description down below. But this video doesn't end here. This is a discussion video. So let's continue this discussion in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much. Goodbye.